Susan. Thank you to the Darien Library, and thank you, of course, to the wonderful audiences gathered here tonight. Through the past four programs of our history of music in the theater, we've talked about music spanning perhaps 300 years or so, from the time of Handel in the early 18th century, through the time of Verdi in week two in the 19th century. Last week, we began talking about the disparities between musical theater and opera that emerged in the 20th century. And we looked at a work that floats between the two idioms at times in Les Miserables from 1980/85, depending on which version we're talking about. Tonight, we're going to look at a musical which has attained what can only be described as meteoric success and has kind of ensconced itself in the canon as one of the most celebrated musicals of the 21st century, and I think it will endure for many decades yet to come. Of course, I'm talking about Hamilton, and this is a work from the second decade of the 21st century. So while most of you are used to hearing me talk about music from the Baroque period, or let's put it from a bygone era, whether it's the classical era or even the Romantic period, tonight we're going to be talking about something which is sort of modern. I put modern in scare quotes because, of course, I think as Aaron Copland famously said, when asked, what did you learn when you went over to study in France, in Europe? This was in the early 20th century. Copland said about modern music, I learned that they're scaring everyone out of the concert halls. Well, that's not the case with Hamilton. Hamilton has, I think, attained widespread acclaim due to particular idiosyncrasies which make it very unique in the canon. So I'll talk about a little bit about that, but first I want to just reinforce some of the differences we discussed last week with respect to opera versus musical theater. We said that in an opera, you're almost always going to get dialogue, a script, a libretto, as they say, a little book is what that translates to, that is sung straight through. It might be sung in a more florid and melodic style, which we called aria, but it might be sung in a more spoken, speech-like approach, which is called recitative. By the time we get to the 20th century, recitative is going to more or less vanish. And you're going to get operas which occasionally contain a reasonable amount of spoken dialogue. By the time we get to musical theater, we now have an idiom which has emerged, and it's got elements of opera, elements of operetta, which remember we said is kind of a lighter opera with maybe a less philosophically driven plot, the kinds that we see in Wagner, for example. We're going to move away from that in the early days of musical theater, although I would suggest that, yes, well, let's say West Side Story is essentially a retelling of the Romeo and Juliet tale. And when we get to the 1970s, we get the rock musicals, Hair and Hairspray, and Pippin and Godspell and others, which sometimes delve into heavier, more thought-provoking subject matter. It's really in the 21st century that we've started to see the emergence of really taboo subject matter. And just to name a few shows, which we won't talk about tonight, but are worthy of mention, and we'll leave them perhaps, Susan, as a desideratum for future classes, for future lectures. Works like Next to Normal, which delves into taboo issues such as mental illness, the kind of morally gray area in which the modern psychopharmacology industry exists, and the effect of mental illness on the family unit. So that's an interesting, to say the least, an interesting subject matter. Later on, you'd have shows just within the last decade like Dear Evan Hansen, which tackle issues like teen depression and suicide. In 2006, we had a reimagining of the Frank Wedekind stage play Spring Awakening, originally Frühling Erwachen, which was turned into a musical with music by a guy named Duncan Sheik. Also in the 21st century, we have recently, in fact, shows like Fun Home, which go into the kind of what you might describe as the difficulties faced by, in this case, a child who grows up with a homosexual parent who's in the closet but having assignations and dalliances and trying to keep it a secret. And then that main character finds out that she's in fact a lesbian and comes out in college. It's, this would be unusual material, of course, to find in opera. Because these subjects were just very taboo back then. They weren't tackled. Today, we're going to look at actually a far more traditional story, although for those of you who know the story of Hamilton, you'll be familiar with some of the salacious details, some of the more lascivious facts associated with the Reynolds pamphlet and the affair that Alexander Hamilton had with one Maria Reynolds in the 1790s. So there is some material here which I would describe as adult material, and there's some adult language in Hamilton. But for the most part, this is a very all-embracing, inviting, and family-friendly show. And essentially, it's very unusual subject matter because historically, having a musical which is a retelling of a period of history, let's say from, in this case, 200 or 215 or 20 years prior to when it was premiered. Well, when Lin-Manuel Miranda read Ron Chernow's biography of Hamilton, the first thing he did was he looked and saw, well, is there a precedent for setting this to the stage? Because, of course, nobody wants to reinvent the wheel. If you're going to write a musical about Hamilton, the first thing you're going to do is your homework and see, well, has Hamilton ever been adapted for stage presentation? And what Miranda found was that, in fact, the answer was no. There was an early 20th century stage play that had a very limited run, limited popularity, was virtually unknown. So this was really an opportunity for him to tell a very compelling story about a figure who, as we'll hear it in the very first number, was kind of erased from many of the history books because history was essentially written by his foes, his rivals. Maybe we can even say his enemies. We'll talk about that later tonight when we get to the character of Aaron Burr and we distinguish fact from fiction. Miranda is actually pretty faithful to the subject matter, to the original content, although he does take liberties, I would say most egregiously, with the relationship between Alexander, his wife Eliza, and his sister-in-law Angelica, who is presented as a kind of third member of a love triangle of sorts in the musical. In a matter of fact, Angelica Schuyler was very close, she was a scholar when he met her. Angelica Schuyler was very close with Alexander Hamilton, and they seemed to share a tremendous bond based off their wittiness, their ability to banter on a very high level, on a very sophisticated level. They were two apparently very intelligent people. However, the romantic angle has been exaggerated for dramatic effect in the musical. We're going to begin momentarily by looking at the opening number, and I'll show you a few things in the score, what to look for, and what makes this musical very special, even from the get-go. But first, a little bit of a background about this show. Well, Lin-Manuel Miranda is a name that I think has become a household name, certainly to people who follow musical theater and are interested in this idiom. One of the things he's known for, which you can see in The Heights, which first, it was a show that he had written about, a decade or so before Hamilton, wound up winning a Tony Award, I think in 2008, I want to say. Maybe more than one, I'm not sure. I'd have to check the records from that year. But one of his signature traits is incorporating rapping into the medium through which the story is told. And I would suggest that in Hamilton, it's really necessary. This is a musical that could really only exist with rapping or a similar way to convey the text. And the reason is because those of you who have seen it know, I heard someone say before the program started, you need to watch it with subtitles because the words go by in a blur and you can very easily miss quite a bit. And the reason this needs to be conveyed in rap is exactly what I just mentioned. There's simply too much story to convey through traditional storytelling, through song, if you will, the way that it would be sung in traditional musical theater. You'd have a 4-hour musical if they tried to do it that way, if he tried to do it that way. And maybe that works if you're a Wagner fan and you like sitting in the seat for 4 hours, and maybe you sit for 2.5, then you get an intermission, you come back, and then you've got Act 2. But for most people, that's stretching the boundary, the limit of what they'd be comfortable listening to. So a lot of text, and that means that if you were casting this show, you would have a particular challenge on your hands. Typically, of course, when somebody casts a musical, you're looking for great singers who can act and often who have had dancing skills as well. But here you need someone who can rap convincingly. That's especially true in this show for, I would say, the actor who plays the Marquis de Lafayette / Thomas Jefferson in Act 2. And Angelica has some rapid text she has to spit out, to use the colloquial phrase for how a rapper would explain or describe enunciating the text they're given. Angelica's got some heavy lifting to do as well. So we're going to look at a few numbers, but because of our time limitations, we're really only going to have time to talk about Act One. So I'll tell you a little bit about how the show is split up, and then we'll get to listening. Act One narrates the early life of Alexander Hamilton, although it should be mentioned that while Ron Chernow spends, I think, something like 6 chapters talking about Alexander's early life, that is to say, everything we know about him growing up, his father leaving when he was a young boy, essentially marooning him with his mother on the island of, anyone know? Starts with an N. Nevis, near St. Kitts. Again, while the biographer, Ron Chernow, spends, let's say, 100 pages or more describing all this history, Lin-Manuel Miranda gets through all of that in one song. It's about 3.5 minutes long. So he's not so interested in the painstaking retelling of this story with every detail. I'll talk momentarily about why the opening 3.5 minutes are so effective at communicating this, essentially what I think many people would find a very detailed and interesting history, but it doesn't need to be spelled out over the course of 5 or 6 numbers. This one can be done with one ensemble number where you introduce the principal dramatis personae, principal cast members, each of whom articulates, they come out and they articulate something really impressive about this character of Hamilton. Therefore, we, the audience, learn a priori, at the very beginning of the show, that he's a remarkable person, or he was a remarkable person, who was prolific, gifted, you might say, someone who had a facility with numbers, who had a mind for math, but who was very articulate and eloquent and able to express himself very clearly, and therefore somebody who, as the opening lays it out, is destined to do great things. The line, of course, that so many are familiar with, just you wait, just you wait. As we make our way to the end of the first number, we learn that Alexander has left the Caribbean for good, it turns out, and he's made his way, well, where else? Somewhere where you can be a new man, as the song goes, and that, of course, is New York. That's where the harmony and the rhythm really starts to pick up, the intensity starts to build, and then we get the main cast members stepping forward. And first we get Alexander's comrades in arms, you might say, those who fought with him in the Revolutionary War. And so John Laurens and the Marquis de Lafayette, or maybe it's Marquis de Lafayette and Hercules Mulligan come first, and they step forward and say, we fought with him. And then John Laurens comes up, another companion from the 18th century, and he says, I died for him. George Washington comes up and says, me, I trusted him. Then we get Eliza and Angelica. They come up, believe it or not, with Mariah Reynolds, and all three say, we loved him. Then we get a pause, a random bar of 3/4, which upsets the meter, creates a kind of rhythmic disturbance. And we get this dissonant half diminished chord, which we'll hear in a minute. And then Aaron Burr comes up and says, and I'm the damn fool who shot him. And then we end with, there's a million things I haven't done, but just you wait. So the show really introduces Burr as kind of the main narrator, at least in the first act. He's the one who, it's clear, we know from history, has a big rivalry. But as we learn in the opening number, there's a line that says something like, you haven't heard about him, you essentially telling the audience, there's a reason why you don't know more about Person. You're going to learn more over the next 2 hours plus. And the reason, of course, is what I said earlier, that essentially his enemies, his foes, his political rivals, however we would describe it, wrote the history books. And therefore, the name Hamilton, while familiar to most, I think many people conjure up his face on the $10 bill. But prior to the 2004 biography, and certainly the musical, I think it's reasonable to say that many people, including many learned adults, probably would have had a limited number of things to say about Alexander Hamilton. So one of the great things about this musical is that it has proven to be a tremendously effective way to teach history. And I know young people who are perhaps, on the surface at least, they would probably say themselves not all that interested in history, but they can quote chapter and verse from this show. And it's taught them about things like federalism and centralized banking and, the state of the British monarchy in the late 18th century, things that they would never imagine learning about perhaps in a musical. It really kind of connects the dots between various disciplines. And that's one of the things that we've said is so powerful about music and theater when united. When you have this dynamic presentation with so many dimensions to it, audience members often walk away enriched in ways that they never anticipated. And I think that's been one of the consistent things we've witnessed with Hamilton. And needless to say, the fact that much of it is sung in an urban style with a non-white cast, Hamilton creator Lin-Manuel Miranda would famously say about that it's the story of Hamilton, the story of America then, told by America now. So when you have these elements, you're going to appeal to a wider audience, to an urban audience, perhaps to a youthful audience, people who are not necessarily fans of musical theater or enough to say whether they're fans or not. And some of the more entrenched opera and traditional musical theater would never imagine listening to rap, and yet they watch Hamilton, and at the end, they're dropping knowledge, as they say in the urban playground where I grew up in Queens. They're ready to again quote chapter and verse in that rap style. So the multi-pronged accessibility, warm and inviting quality of this musical can't be overstated. Let's take a look at the score, and we'll listen to the very first number together. Well, you can see how it starts here. Aaron Burr, of course, as I said, the narrator. This is a really weird way to start a musical. Weird because it's a bar which just starts on one note, F sharp, and then moves through a series of inverted chords which are unstable, and then just settles on a single tone. So this is not a big, grand overture that we might expect. Instead, we get something very simplistic. In fact, you might even describe it as minimalist. Just a single note, single note, single note, B, F sharp, G, D, A sharp. Very simple, with snaps to give us a little bit of rhythm, and of course, to give the actor who's playing Burr, in this case, a chance to start to gesticulate a little bit. And what's interesting about this, and I think what surprises many people, is that they somehow imagine that rap, wouldn't or couldn't be rendered in traditional musical notation. But you'll see here in the score, let me make it a little bit bigger actually, it is perfectly capable of being rendered in traditional musical notation. We use these X's on the note head to denote the fact that it's not going to be sung, but it's going to be spoken. And it should be said that there is a distinction musicologists draw between rap and hip hop. And, these are emerging and still developing genres, but the current scholarship seems to agree that the difference is that in rap, you have really just spoken word with perhaps some percussion. But with hip hop, you start to introduce some melodic underscoring. So while this, may be described as rap, I think with some degree of accuracy, it's closer to hip hop because, again, it does have melodic underscoring, which we'll see will be built up. One of the things that you can do by starting with this, what I call minimalist music, is build it up. And so you'll see, especially when we get to the line about him leaving the Caribbean, leaving Nevis and coming to New York, and this idea of in New York reinventing himself, being a new man, the music's going to really intensify. As listeners, we're very cognizant of that journey, whether it's subconscious or conscious. We're aware of the fact that we started with very little, and now we've built up to something very grand, very bombastic. Maybe there's great pageantry, there's depth to the presentation. So actually, it's a way to start the musical. Let's listen to the opening number, which of course is titled Alexander Hamilton, just under 4 minutes long. Well, hopefully you could detect some of those things we talked about. Here's that offbeat measure I mentioned, which creates that rhythmic dissonance. It really sets up Burr. It's the asymmetry, right? These are all sort of friends and admirers. And then you have Burr step up, and he's totally set apart from the rest who are sort of speaking in a regular cadence. With Burr, it's hesitation, it's regret. There's something deep here that's written into the score. It's quite effective. Here's the line, of course, that I think many of us are pondering right now. His enemies destroyed his rep, America forgot him. So this is an opportunity for us as audience members to learn about this guy, but it's also an opportunity for the composer and the cast and everyone involved in the production to convey the details and relate the story of a really remarkable person. And when we get to the end of tonight's program in about 35 or 40 minutes, we'll see by the end of Act One even, Hamilton has achieved a remarkable oeuvre, an output, a repertoire, if you will. He's been able to create at a prolific pace, even as a young man. So, this is iconic music already. I think the opening of Hamilton is well known to many. Let's talk about what comes next. We talked about how Burr has a very important role in this musical. Well, obviously, I think anyone who knows how Alexander Hamilton's life ended in Weehawken, New Jersey, remember, everything is legal in New Jersey. For those who know the story, you know that Burr is going to factor prominently. What you perhaps didn't know is that Burr's music is going to be an amazingly important underpinning for so much of what transpires in the musical. Now, it's not always obvious. I would liken the use of specific repeating chord progressions and bass lines here as similar to what we might encounter in the works of Wagner, especially in, say, the Ring Cycle, where every character gets their own sort of theme, fragment, or cell of music, whether it's more rhythmic or more harmonic or more melodic. The same is true in Hamilton. Almost every character gets very specific music that recurs. So Eliza has her own music, and Burr obviously has his music. Hamilton has his music. We actually saw it here. This is sort of the Alexander Hamilton theme, typically sung, on the top voice here. I know singing doesn't come across well on Zoom, but you can, for those of you who don't have any music reading chops, this is that. That's going to be the melody or musical leitmotif, if I can call it that we associate with the character of Hamilton. Burr's music is a little bit more obscure. You have to listen for the bass line here because Burr's music is harmonic, but it's mostly in the bass. And it sounds a little bit like this. C, A minor, E minor. That's kind of going to be his theme. Sometimes rhythmicized like so. Bum, 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 bum. Bum, 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 like that. So again, the chords here, C, A minor, E minor, that doesn't matter. Who cares what the chords are? It's the bass line that we're going to recognize. We're going to hear it 3 times tonight in 3 different numbers, and I think you'll find it to be quite effective. Here's the moment in the musical where Hamilton meets Burr, and I don't think it's a coincidence that right after he gets off the ship in New York, the next scene we as the audience see is his meeting with Aaron Burr. Of course, much transpired in the interim, but it's very telling that Miranda jumps right to the scene. What it suggests is that he's framing this musical around this very complex relationship between these two one-time friends, later maybe frenemies, and of course, by the end of the story, bitter rivals. So here's Aaron Burr. We're only going to listen to about 1.5 minutes. See how the music, I talked about these X note heads that denote rapped lines. Notice how fluidly Miranda's going to go from rapping to singing. So you can watch the note heads. If it has an X on it, it's rapped. Otherwise, it's going to be sung. Here's excerpt number 2, second number in the show. Can you hear that bass line? C, A minor, E minor. Keep listening for that. It's going to be the most identifiable part of Burr's melody. Although again, because it's in the bass, it's not always as obvious. We continue. We're going to pause it here. A lot of interesting exposition in the story. We learn that there are some parallels between these 2 characters, right? You're an orphan. Of course, I'm an orphan too. Okay, so that much is true. We know that's backed up by the history. The attitudes here are antipodes, right? Hamilton comes across as young, gung-ho, wears his heart on his sleeve, you might say, maybe a bit foolish, I wish there was a war, then we could prove we're worth more than anyone bargained for. And look at the rhythm here. This is pretty complex. War, then we could prove we're worth than anyone bargained for. That's what with the 16th note triplet and a dotted 16th into a 32nd. The rhythm here can be really tricky, even for a student who's got some music theory. They might have trouble with this if they didn't know the show in advance. For those of you who know the show, it seems very easy to match the rhythms, what's written, to what you know. But again, if you were just looking at this for the first time, it would be quite complex. All right, here's the important thing. Hamilton is gung-ho. He says, well, let's have a war. We can show what we're made of, what we're worth. And Burr's response is, talk less, smile more. Don't let them know what you're against or for. Fools who run their mouth off wind up dead. This is a very interesting point in the musical. We're really presented with two opposing, you might say, worldviews. Hamilton, who is completely unabashed and shares his thoughts willy-nilly, you might say shoots from the hip, as a later generation would say. And Burr, who comes across as cagey, evasive. I think many people might say he comes across like a cheap politician, somebody who is hesitant to commit to very strong convictions, and so much so that it becomes difficult to know if they have any convictions at all. That's something that Hamilton will accuse Burr of at the end of Act 1. He says something like, for once in your life, take a stand with pride. I don't understand how you stand to the side. We also learn a little bit about Burr. What does he say when he's asked, how did you graduate in 2 years? He says, it was my parents' dying wish. So we seem to get this impression that Burr feels a connection to his parents, to his legacy. He's got a reputation to protect, a legacy to protect. Whereas Hamilton, being an orphan who came from nothing, doesn't have that on his shoulders to carry. Well, what happens next in the musicals? We get more exposition. We meet Hamilton's friends, I guess you call them, his comrades in arms, those who fought with him in the war. But I'm going to fast forward and jump to the moment after the colonies declare their independence, and we have the outbreak of war. And we're going to meet now the character who, as we've seen in so many of the musicals and operas we've talked about, often we get comic relief. In The Magic Flute, it's Papageno. In Don Giovanni, it's Leporello. But here, it's the character of King George III. He's the guy who's going to make you chuckle. Famously, the role originated by Jonathan Groff of Frozen and Frozen 2 fame. Recently, he was Seymour in Little Shop of Horrors. And we're going to hear him sing the role of George III. A little bit about the historic King George III, sometimes called the Mad King, right? Some of us are familiar with that designation, that King George III of England was regarded as being off his rocker, as a later generation would say. Insane. Was he insane? Well, the answer is yes. Most historians think there was something seriously, cognitively wrong with the man. Some of the idiosyncrasies that he displayed, for example, in the 1780s, he received a Danish diplomat, and he got off his throne, walked over to the man, and produced from inside of his cloak a cabbage. And he handed it to the guy and said, I shall grant thee a cabbage, randomly, out of nowhere. Pretty unusual. He was also known for what historians have called excessive loquacity, which means that he rambled, I think is probably what that means, that he spoke not unintelligently or incoherently, but just spoke and spoke and spoke. There are stories of him writing letters where some of these sentences can have 200 words in them. So they're rambling, run-on sentences with adjective after adjective after adjective after adjective before he gets to the noun. So was he crazy? Probably. There have been stage interpretations such as The Madness of King George that have put that on full display. There's a wonderful collection of songs by a British composer named Peter Maxwell Davies. It's called 8 Songs for a Mad King, and it's brilliant, but it's a creative, I think, musical interpretation of some of his letters, which are set to music. And these letters demonstrate, I don't have a DSM-5 in front of me, but they illustrate mental illness of some sort. And they're imagined very cleverly by the composer. I think what Lin-Manuel Miranda does with him is very interesting. This is an example of what I would call a huge chasm, a mile-wide divide between the affect, the emotional affect of the music, and the actual text being sung. Now, when you go to study music in college or conservatory, and when you start writing, one of the things that's stressed, we stress this in music history too, is that, starting in the Baroque period, composers put a huge emphasis on marrying the text with the music, that the music should really follow the text and frame it correctly. On the surface, it may seem like Lin-Manuel Miranda doing the opposite here, but actually it's very effective, because what he's doing is he's conjuring a very complex human emotional state. And that, of course, is for the king, it's this delusional, crazy, paternal, violent, brutal character in a very ironic way. So what you're going to hear is, for example, the sweetest moment where the music goes off beat to a beautiful C major add 9 chord. It's a very lush kind of chord, almost romantic sounding. And it's on the spot in the music where the king says, "I will send a fully armed battalion to remind you of my love." So here the king comes across as a father who's chastising a wayward teen, maybe. You know, the colonies are my children and they rebelled against me. They're up in arms in a revolt. I'm going to teach you a lesson, as any parent would do. Now, you know, maybe a parent these days would take away video games or internet privileges. But no, King George III is going to go shoot you and send his armies to mow you down with cannon fire. And he sings about it in the most gentle and paternal and sweet way. There's also humor here in I guess what you would call the ridiculousness of the vocal line. The chorus of this song has the king singing nonsense syllables on combinations of phonemes like da, ya, do, da, 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 ya, da, 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 like that. And what it does is it gives the king something completely undignified and unroyal, I guess you might say, to sing. In other words, a king's music should be very smooth, very legato, very polished. It should have a character of being stately and melodic. And for the chorus of this one, we get the opposite. The king is singing this haphazard melody that leaps all over the place and sounds like a child who's having an especially petulant temper tantrum. Let's listen to song number 7 in the musical. This is it's called "You'll Be Back," and it comes right after a moment in the musical where Hamilton debates a guy named Samuel Seabury. We actually have a descendant of Samuel Seabury at Naugatuck Valley Community College, who's a fantastic singer and a great math professor and great friend. So I asked him when I first came across the score, and I said, "Oh, Samuel Seabury, are you related to him? I thought it was a joke." And he said, "No, I am, really." Anyway, so Hamilton refutes the monarchist leanings of Samuel Seabury, and then we cut to the king, and he says, "You'll be back." Here is track 7. Again, the singer here is Jonathan Groff. You can't help but chuckle. Certainly, if you've never seen this, many of you are no doubt guffawing right now. Did you notice that moment, that sweet chord that frames the words, "I will kill your friends and family to remind you of my love"? Again, we get the image of George III as he understands himself as a sort of caring parent who's got to chastise a naughty child. The naughty child here, of course, being the American colonies, who need to be punished for, well, rebelling. And how do you punish them? You know, send the cavalry and send the artillery and blast them to smithereens, mutilate, kill, and absolutely subdue them. And that's what a caring parent does. And he actually, the whole point of the song is, you know, nobody really wants independence. These foolish colonists think they want independence, but they'll come crawling back to the crown before they know it. And, you know, as a king who comes out on stage wearing the full regalia, right? Those of you who have seen the presentation, which we'll discuss how to watch it at the end of the program, those of you who've seen the presentation know that when the actor who comes out, Jonathan Groff comes out, he's in full royal regalia. And there is a kind of a cognitive dissonance between seeing this stately appearance and having him sing that ridiculous chorus with this punchy harpsichord synth sound on the keyboard. It's really brilliant. I mean, channeling in music, we often talk about how major keys correspond to happiness and minor keys correspond to sadness or lamentation. But what we don't talk about is how to conjure up more complex states. How do you conjure irony? How do you conjure sarcasm? How do you humiliate the character, but not the singer? You see the idea here? Mozart does it with the magic flute, with the Queen of the Night. In 1791, being a queen was not a good thing. So Mozart is depicting the Queen of the Night as a sinister and unsavory character. But how does he do it? How does he make her seem like a bag of wind? He has her sing in the stratosphere, have her go up to those sky-high notes in the sixth octave, and all of a sudden it deflates her. It makes her look like a caricature. The same thing is true of King George III here. He's yes, that's right. Someone in chat is reading. That's right. He had Porphyria, which, the House of Hanover, like so many royal families, there was a lot of, they would have thought of it as keeping the bloodlines pure by marrying within the family, but that led to all sorts of genetic disorders. And the House of Hanover, which began their rule of England in the early 1700s, I think 1709, with George I, they were known for that. So absolutely. And Mary Queen of Scots, who lived during the time of the end of the Tudors, roughly corresponding to the reign of Elizabeth I as well. That's right. Yeah. Okay, many of you are familiar with this principle, I think, in the story of the Russian royal family by the time we get to the late 19th century, and the cases of von Willebrand syndrome and hemophilia. This is not uncommon in those royal families where they often married within the family to keep the bloodlines pure. All right. Next up, I want to take a look at, we're going to revisit the music of Aaron Burr, and we're going to look at a song which Lin-Manuel himself described as one of the two strongest songs he ever wrote, not just for the show, but in his entire life. And the song is called Wait For It. Now, I mentioned earlier that in the show, Aaron Burr, in the opening, when he meets Hamilton, comes across as, I called him cagey and evasive. Remember what he says? Talk less, smile more. Don't let him know what you're against or what you're for. Now, we as the audience might be rooting against Burr because we know how the story ends. And if Hamilton is kind of our hero, then Burr is he's the villain in the story, is he not? That's kind of how it's framed. What I think is so effective about Wait For It comes about a little bit past halfway through Act 1, is that it presents Aaron Burr in a completely different light than that which we've seen him so far. This is his first number to kind of express himself to the audience without other characters around. And we learn a little bit about why he is so closed off, why he does take these evasive maneuvers when it comes to stating his policy and articulating his feelings and his thoughts and his convictions. We learn about it here. And I would suggest that it's, at this point, this is a watershed moment in the musical, because this is when we start to consider whether Aaron Burr, maybe he's not a villain, maybe he's a kind of anti-hero in this story. It's much more complex than a simple black and white designation of, well, Burr is the bad guy and Hamilton's the good guy. We'll see throughout the story that Hamilton does things which can only be described as morally questionable, and Burr, whatever flaws he may have carried with him, is at least consistent in how he behaves. So, for example, there's a moment in Act 2, which we won't listen to, where Hamilton confronts Burr angrily. He says something to him, this is where we learn that Burr has run for Senate and he's unseated Hamilton's father-in-law. And Hamilton's furious. He says, Burr, since when are you a Democratic Republican? And Burr's line is, since being one, put me on the up and up again. In other words, both of these men are incredibly ambitious, Machiavellian almost, at least in the case of Burr there, with what he says about running against Hamilton's father-in-law. Here, he's deeply humanized. We learn a lot about him, and it doesn't hurt when you have a singer like Leslie Odom Jr., who's originating the role of Burr and can deliver this music, which is great music, the way it's written, but to deliver it with pathos and with depth and to bring us inside the world of Aaron Burr as he's portrayed in the musical. Again, it's way beyond, this is a happy song, this is a sad song. It's so complex. There's many layers here to peel back. So let's go ahead and listen to Wait For It. And then we'll actually hear this music and those words repeated at the end of the first act. Remember what I talked about when I introduced the idea of leitmotivic music. Here's, just look at the chords. Before it was, if you remember, C, A minor, E minor. So let's call this You know, D flat, B flat minor, F minor. It's the same chord progression. You see that it's just been moved up a step. I sang it at the same pitch, but at irrelevant where it sounds. So we have the same music that we heard earlier, but now with more urgency here. You can see it's very fast. When Burr starts singing, he's very low. Do you see this? You know, even if you don't read music, you know, you can tell that on the staff, he's lower down. So once again, the composer is going to give the chance for the music to simmer a little bit and then build up to this boiling point where it's going to explode. And then we're going to really unleash the vocals from the singer. So, you know, I would describe the Burr part if I were casting this musical, which one day the rights will be available, hopefully, and not in the too distant future, I hope. You know, this is a role where you really need a superb actor who's also a superb singer, which is different from the Hamilton role. The Hamilton role is not written as a virtuoso vocal part. And I think Lin-Manuel would happily admit that he is the weakest vocalist in the show, in that original cast. But it's kind of not really relevant because, again, the Hamilton part is not written. It doesn't go up super high. It's a nice, comfortable baritone part, whereas Burr has to do quite a bit more in songs like this. You'll see that. The other song that Lin-Manuel described as being one of the best he wrote in his whole career was also written for the character of Burr and originated by Leslie Odom Jr., and that's in Act 2, that one called The Room Where It Happened. We won't listen to it tonight, but for those of you who are keeping notes and thinking about what to listen to after we're done, that's certainly worth listening to. All right, so here is, wait for it, from a little bit past the middle of Act 1. As I said, a lot of meat on the bone with the text here. He introduces what I think for many would be revelatory details about his own life. For example, in the beginning, he talks about his this love affair he's having with Theodosia. There's a whole song that has her name in it towards the end of Act 1. And who is this Theodosia? We learn that she's the wife of a British officer serving in Georgia. Therefore, Hamilton, his nemesis in the show, you know, isn't as buttoned up and flawless as we might have otherwise guessed. He's engaging in open adultery, and in most cultures, certainly in the Western world, adultery is a very bad thing. However, it seems that Burr has a rather carefree attitude about this, as he says, life doesn't discriminate between the sinners and the saints. Later, he's going to say, love doesn't discriminate between the sinner and the saint. And finally, he'll say, death doesn't discriminate between the sinner and the saint. So this reinforces that Machiavellian attitude, this, I'll do anything it takes to climb and to do what I need to do to survive. If there's a reason that I'm still alive when so many around me have died, you know, this is a reference to the war, no doubt. Well, he cusses and he says, well, gosh darn it. Except he doesn't say gosh darn it. He says, I'm willing to wait for it. And then he goes up into the fourth octave and starts with the belting register. It's very powerful. Did you notice how Miranda uses silence in this number to set up those big moments? We don't talk about that enough. The idea that silence can be just as effective as notes, you know, setting up those big moments. We'll talk about a very effective use of silence in the ending number of Act 1. One more thing about this is the moment where the music gets the most dissonant is when he's talking about Hamilton. And he says something like, you know, Hamilton faces an uphill climb, and he alludes to Hamilton's rise, his productivity, his ascent. And of course, at this time, we know that Hamilton during the war served as George Washington's, well, his right-hand man, his aide-de-camp at first, and then before the Battle of Yorktown, he gets command of his own battalion and gets to sort of do what he wants to do, Hamilton, by commanding troops in the field. Meanwhile, Burr is watching his meteoric rise. And, you know, for those of you who have seen the movie Amadeus, we know that the movie Amadeus and the story of Mozart, there's a lot of parallels there, right? Antonio Salieri is the anti-hero, I guess, in that story. He's the nemesis. He's the villain, I guess. But because we learn so much about him, we get a multi-dimensional view of that feud. And we get a similar angle, right? In Salieri's case, for those of you who don't know, Antonio Salieri was a composer who lived and worked at the same time of Mozart and watched Mozart come to town in Vienna and attain incredible heights at an unmatchable pace. And we get the impression that Burr, by the way, who Burr and Hamilton lived during the same era as Mozart, late 18th century, they were a little bit younger. We get the impression that Burr feels the same way. He's watching Hamilton rise, this meteoric rise to unprecedented heights, and it's very difficult for him to imagine keeping up with it. So what he says instead here is, well, I don't know when my shot is coming, but I'm waiting for it. And this is a kind of antipode to what Hamilton says at the very beginning of the show, which we didn't listen to. There's a whole long number called I Am Not Throwing Away My Shot. To summarize, what we get here in Act 1, we're just barely past halfway in Act 1, is two important figures positioned in opposition, both waiting to spring, waiting to seize opportunities, but having entirely different skill sets. Burr being more, again, to use that term I used earlier, cagey, being more evasive, being more non-committal, and Hamilton being verbose and in your face, and very much willing to state his convictions on the spot. All right, we have time for one more, so I'm going to go all the way to the end of Act 1. This is a song called Nonstop. And to catch us all up, at this point in the musical, the war has been won. We have a really exciting number which gives the cast an opportunity to show off their dance chops. It's called Yorktown, the world turned upside down. And in it, we get a kind of a running narration of the Battle of Yorktown and how the Continental Army finally vanquishes the British and forces a surrender. So we might ask ourselves, well, what comes next? Actually, George III is going to sing a song right after Yorktown. And he says, what comes next? And I think as theater goers, we might wonder, from a dramatic perspective, what to expect. After all, there's something inherently theatrical about war, isn't there? That if the first act of Hamilton is about, the Revolutionary War and Hamilton's contributions and his rise and his relationship with Washington and the other figures, meeting his wife, etc., then what would Act 2 be about? Isn't that a good question? Is Act 2 going to be about, forming a government and creating banks? And if it is that interesting theater? How many people are going to go watch a show that's about, the writing of the Federalist Papers? Has anybody tried to read the Federalist Papers? Well, I would suggest that on the surface, it's not very compelling material. And that's why the end of Act 1 has a very important role here in the music. The music's got to sell you on Act 2. It's got to prepare you as an audience member and to excite you for material that, if it's not told the right way, it could come across as very dry. Actually, Act 2 has some thrilling moments in it, but I would suggest that that it's at the end of Act 1 where we get, as listeners, we get this amazing synthesis of everything we've heard in Act 1 so far. So let me show you the score. Well, look at that in chat. Yes, Barbara says Mozart and Burr were both born 1756. So amazing. And Hamilton perhaps a year earlier or later. So they're all the same age. And George Washington, by the way, was born a few months apart from Franz Joseph Haydn in 1732. We often don't conflate these people's lives, do we? Do we think of Mozart and Alexander Hamilton as being, around in the same time? We think about it, we do, but if you think about one, you don't think about the other typically. All right, let's look at the score, and we'll wrap in about 15 minutes. So we're going to go to the end of Act 1. And again, the song is called Nonstop. It's a long number. It's going to bring out the whole cast. And that's not atypical. We know that in the end of an act, you're usually going to have a big ensemble number. So we have a very short number here, and here's Nonstop. Okay. So what's going on in this number? I would suggest there's 3 or 4 storyline threads which are woven together here. The war has ended. So what important developments are going to take place? Well, geographically, the scene shifts. From Yorktown, we go back to where it starts in New York. And we learn that in New York, both Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr practiced law after the war. And in fact, they teamed together and were co-counselors in the first murder trial. They defended the defendants. Well, that makes sense. whose name was Levi Weeks. They both defended him and got him acquitted. And we learn that Hamilton is going to approach Burr and ask him for help. And Burr says, well, what do you need help with? And he says, the Constitution. It needs amendments. It's flawed. I need your help, Burr. Burr, of course, turns him down. Hamilton, for the first time in the musical, gets agitated with Burr. It says something like, why, for once in your life, take a stand with pride. I don't understand why you stand to the side. He accuses him of being a coward, essentially. Then Burr gets his music, and what do you think he's going to sing? Well, he's going to come back with music from, you guessed it, it's the Wait For It music. And he doesn't actually say wait for it, but the chorus behind him does. So we'll see that momentarily. In other words, this is used as a number to advance the rivalry plot between Burr and Hamilton. What else is happening here? Well, the war is over, but the government hasn't really formed yet. So towards the end of the song, Washington makes his appearance. And Washington tends to get very complex chords with added ninths and 11ths and 13ths. It's very, on a music theory level, you might make the argument that Washington's chords are the most complex. He has the most ambiguous and colorful harmony in the show. And what Washington says is, basically, I'm being asked to lead, I need a right-hand man. And that's when we learn that Hamilton will be appointed Secretary of the Treasury. But this creates conflict with his wife, because after all, the war has been fought. He's finally home. He's now got a young son and more children on the way, but he's got to leave. He's not going to be home as much because he's got to go serve the U.S., the nascent and inchoate U.S. government. So that's another thread. We learn that Angelica is leaving the States. That's Hamilton's sister-in-law, with whom, in the musical at least, it's suggested that there's a great deal of affection between the two. And Angelica shows up, and she's got her own leitmotif, and she says, I'm going off to London because I've got a rich husband. Finally, we end with the music from Nonstop, from Wait For It. It's the Aaron Burr music that carries most of this number. And the last thing that we hear, over very dissonant harmony, and I mean very dissonant, you'll see it, you'll hear it, is Alexander Hamilton saying, I'm not throwing away my shot, while the chorus sings the very opening words that we heard, just you wait, and then all together they sing Alexander Hamilton, Hamilton, just you wait. Finally, we get a big E minor chord, and then Hamilton says, I am not throwing away my bang shot. So it's a tour de force number. It's like 6 minutes long, and there's a whole lot more to say about it, but let's listen to it so we have time for a brief discussion after, perhaps. If you want to talk about a way to set up excitement for Act Two, this is a clinic on how to leave your audience feeling giddy as the curtain comes down. And of course, in Act Two, we get also, I think, something like 20 numbers. So this is a huge show. There's, I think, 43 or 45 named numbers. To give you a comparison, in shows like Little Shop of Horrors, which is admittedly a shorter show, you might get something like 17 numbers. So everything here is either sung or rapped. There's really almost no spoken dialogue that I can think of. And we talked about it. To get it through in 2.5 hours or however long it is, it really needs to be delivered crisply and quickly. So rap is a perfect medium for doing so. Did you hear the various leitmotifs popping up there? Burr's bass line, the Alexander Hamilton, that descending minor third. You heard Eliza's music, where she says, basically, would it be enough to stay alive, which is one of her songs. Earlier in Act One, we hear Angelica's music from Satisfied, He Will Never Be Satisfied. There's an awful lot going on here. And this is, as we saw last week with Les Mis, it's really advantageous to have a score or a libretto in front of you sometimes when you watch it, because a lot of these details are very difficult to process in real time, especially if it's your first time watching the presentation. So with that, I would encourage everyone to do two things if you haven't done them already. Go to your local library or bookstore and check out the biography of Alexander Hamilton by Ron Chernow from 2004. And the other thing I would suggest you do is head over to Disney Plus. And if you don't have a Disney Plus subscription, well, if you've got grandkids, then call their parents and say, hey, I want your Disney Plus info, because the odds are that it's somewhere in the family. If you shake a few branches, a Disney Plus password will fall out of every family tree. Um, and check out Hamilton because it's a really remarkable addition to the canon of musical theater. And I think it's given everyone from professors and scholars to writers to critics to performers and directors, music directors. This has generated a tremendous amount of excitement in a way that I think it's earned every bit of it. So I hope that's come across tonight just through the 4 or 5 numbers we looked at. Susan, I want to thank the Darien Library. This has been a blast to do these programs. And I understand I had a brief conversation with our dear friend Pat Sheary, and I understand that we're going to be back this fall.